I'd look at that name and think to myself, you have to drag me out of here in a body bag before I ever voluntarily give up and quit on that name. And then those 5 key words that are everything to everything. If you can keep it. If you can keep it. And so how do we muster up this courage? How do we avoid being cowards? You muster it up by remembering those that have gone before you. In the worst of conditions, I rely upon the legacy of those who have gone before me to steady my resolve, to guide my every deed.
We have a speaker today that I'm sure is familiar to almost all of you. I'm going to read a quick background on him anyway. Born and raised in Huntington Beach, Chad is a graduate of Huntington Beach High School, and shortly after the days of 9/11 enlisted to become a United States Navy SEAL. There isn't much more that needs to be said about that. After completing his service, he married his high school sweetheart. Chad went on to become the best-selling author and highly sought-after speaker, where he shares his lessons learned from battlefield to business with corporate groups around the nation. With his wife raising their 2 children in the hometown he was raised up in, the conviction to serve his city through civic duty etched its way into his heart. In November 2024, Chad was elected to City Council, earning the most votes ever recorded in the history of Huntington Beach. Carrying the same principles that guided him to and through the SEAL teams, Chad is committed to serving with integrity and fighting for the heart and soul of Huntington Beach, while holding fast to what is good and true. Chad Williams, please come to the microphone.
All right, well, good afternoon. Memorial Day is all about remembering those who have paid the ultimate price, and I think Memorial Day hits different for a lot of different people. If I could share some personal stories with you all, my mind goes to my mentor, an extraordinary Navy SEAL by the name of Scott Helvenston. Scott holds all kinds of records. He's the youngest man to ever make it through SEAL training. Talk about a guy that was not the victim of his circumstances. He grew up in over 20 different foster homes. He became a U.S. Navy SEAL by the age of 17 years old, completed the program. On top of that, he's also a world champion pentathlete. He's the fastest Navy SEAL that we have on the SEAL training obstacle course. So to kind of put that in perspective, every single Navy SEAL that ever was, is, or will be, we run through the same obstacle course. It's timed, it's recorded. This SEAL beats every SEAL that there ever was. And then one more kind of a funny one. You know, Scott really took me under his wing. He became like a second father to me as he's mentoring me, investing into me. And I realized what a special opportunity this was. So I'll never forget one day, we're going to go mountain climbing. Never been mountain climbing before. So we're loading up the truck and I'm jumping into the passenger seat. And I'm trying to burn into my memory this memory. I don't want to forget it. So he's there, got his arm up there on the wheel. Sun kind of cascading through that windshield, and I'm looking over at him, and I'm just taking mental pictures. I'm like, man, I want my arms to be like Scott's one day. You know, like I idolize him. And he's telling me, he goes, you know, Junior, I was on this TV program one time called Man vs. Beast. And he begins to describe this program to me, and what it was these Hollywood producers would take a wild animal, a beast, and put him up against a human being, an athlete in a competition, a strength or speed. And the whole premise of this show is that the beast always wins, hands down. The human athlete kind of looks foolish. Well, they hear about Scott and his incredible ability to run through an obstacle course, so they say, forget just getting some athlete, let's get that Navy SEAL, let's get that notch on our belt. And so they get him on the phone, and they say, hey, you know, we hear you're something special, would you be willing to go up against the beast on Man vs. Beast? Well, Scott, never being the kind of guy to back down, he's like, yeah, I'll race the monkey. And so he shows up. He's there on the starting line, cameras are out, boom, they take off head to head. The irony is that Scott pulls ahead of the monkey on the monkey bars. He beats this thing on the program. And so as we're driving along, he's like, you know, Junior, they wanted me to rematch that monkey. I raced it again, and then they didn't want to air the program, but contractually they had to, so they re-air all the other programs where the beast wins and the human loses, but my program, they only aired it once, just one time on prime time. And so you can imagine what it's like to get trained up by this fella. And so he trained me up, and I sign up. I've got a date now. It's set. I'm going to be shipping off for boot camp. Well, he takes an opportunity, as he put it, to go overseas one last time. And so he's hopping on the phone with me. He's telling me, all right, Junior, I'm about to go do this thing. He's referring to going off to Iraq. And he says, I want you to know something, though. I've never told anyone I've ever trained before. He says, I know you're going to make it. And to hear those words from my mentor, to this day, I don't have the words to just describe how much it filled me up, how much I couldn't wait to make him proud, to fulfill those words. Those essentially would be the last words that we would exchange. It's just a number of days later, I would turn on a television, first to see a smiling picture of him on TV. And I'm looking at the smiling image thinking, what's Scott doing on TV again? And I'm not really tuned into the words in the background, but then I see in the lower third of the screen Scott's birth date, followed by a dash. And it says March 31st, 2004. Before I could really process in my mind just the logical conclusion of what that means, this still image, this smiling image of him switches. And now I'm looking at graphic video footage of a vehicle that's engulfed in flames in Fallujah, Iraq, which turned out to be the very vehicle that he was in, along with 3 other Americans, as this group of insurgents had ambushed the vehicle, and then they began to videotape and record and spread this footage around. As I'm watching my mentor, that same arm I've got locked into my memory, thinking I want my arms to be just like Scott's one day. I'm looking at those same arms, and there's no life left in them as he's in the street. And this mob has surrounded his body with sticks and rods, and they're doing everything they can to mutilate his and the other bodies. And then they wrap rope around his legs, they hook him up to a vehicle, and they went dragging him through the streets of Fallujah. And to them, you could see the glee on their faces as it was a celebration. And they strung them upside down from the Euphrates River Bridge, and they set their bodies on fire. And what's burned into my memory is the words that they were chanting as they looked into the camera gleefully. They chanted repeatedly, Fallujah is the graveyard of Americans. Fallujah is the graveyard of Americans. I think, needless to say, I'll never have the words to describe what that moment and all those surrounding moments were like. But there is a takeaway here. You know, I ended up writing Scott's name on the inside of my hat when I was going through SEAL training. And really, this is just a reminder of the price of freedom. One other date that comes to mind would be August 6, 2011. It was the greatest loss of American life in Afghanistan. It was the greatest loss of life in the SEAL teams, as a group of Army Rangers had gotten into a gun battle with the Taliban, going after a high-value target. They called in for a QRF, which is a quick reaction force. There are 30 Americans on the forward operating base that were standing by, ready to answer that call. They boarded a helicopter with the call sign Extortion 17, and it just so happened to be 17 on board were Navy SEALs. Navy SEALs that were, many of them, involved in the capture and killing of America's most wanted, Osama bin Laden, at the time, alongside their service dog. But long before they ever boarded that helicopter, they sat down to interview and tell the story of one of their fallen brothers by the name of Adam Brown, with an author by the name of Eric Blem. Well, as these SEALs took off with these others to go and try and react and help out these Army Rangers, it was a 1 in a million shot as they took a hit to the rear rotor by an RPG and they went plummeting into the ground, killing all 30 Americans on board along with their service dog named Bart. One SEAL recalls looking at a live ISR screen that shows the heat images, seeing his brothers falling out of the back of the helicopter as these heat images, the signature being white for heat, slowly faded to black as their life went out from them. Memorial Day. We remember those who have gone before us and paid the ultimate price. One of the last lines of our SEAL Creed reads like this. It says, in the worst of conditions, I will rely upon the legacy of those who have gone before me to steady my resolve, to guide my every deed. We are not called to be cowards in this world. We are called to be courageous. I think it begs the question, though, where do you muster up that courage? Where will it come from? It comes from remembering. You remember the legacy of those who have gone before you, that have paid that ultimate price. When I entered into SEAL training, we start with 173 guys that they all start strong saying, I'll die before I quit. Well, that's going to get pressure tested. It's been said, he who has a why can endure anyhow. I alluded to the fact that they let you write on the inside bill of your hat going through SEAL training. And I'll tell you, on the other side of graduation, those that made it, what I never saw on the inside of anyone's hat that made it was their own name. It was never something selfish. It was no selfish ambition. It was remembering those that had gone before them. It was fighting for something bigger and greater than self. In fact, the common theme on the inside of most hats was simply this: When I looked around, it was faith, it was family, it was friends. Looking back, that's exactly what I had on the inside of my hat. And here's hopefully a takeaway for all of us, right? Is that when you do something for something more than yourself, like family, here was my thought process when I'm suffering in Hell Week. It's 5.5 days long. You get 4 hours of sleep. That's not per night. That's 4 hours for the next 5.5 days. You're running over 200 miles. You're getting surf tortured in the ocean. Went through in February, so you're going out in the dark hours of the morning without a wetsuit on. You're so cold, they call it jackhammering cold because you look like you're hanging on to a jackhammer. Of course, you're hallucinating after all that physical exertion and sleep deprivation. I grew up watching Ninja Turtles, so I'm like right there with Donatello, right next to me. But when I had to really dig deep, what I would do is glance my eyes up past my eyebrows, and on the inside of my hat, I would see family, and I would think to myself, my family's not going to get a phone call from me, hearing from me, when they should not be hearing from me. Like, hey, I quit, I didn't make it. No, I'd rather die than quit on my family. You only go so far for yourself. I saw my mentor's name on the inside of the hat, Scott Halvinston. I'd look at that name and think to myself, you have to drag me out of here in a body bag before I ever voluntarily give up and quit on that name. And that's just what it is. When people give up, you're voluntarily giving up. Benjamin Franklin, he told us when asked, what form of government will we have? He says it's a republic. And then those 5 key words that are everything to everything. If you can keep it. If you can keep it. And so how do we muster up this courage? How do we avoid being cowards? You muster it up by remembering those that have gone before you. In the worst of conditions, I rely upon the legacy of those who have gone before me to steady my resolve, to guide my every deed. Now, just briefly, because I don't want to take too much time here, but I alluded to the fact that those 17 SEALs that boarded Extortion 17, many of them sat down to tell the story of Adam Brown. What would be Adam's last operation in Afghanistan, they were going after a high-value target, and they were taking shots. They were pinned down under heavy enemy fire, and there was a man that was shooting through a window with an AK-47. Nobody had an angle on this guy, and the call goes out over the radio, like somebody needs to get a grenade through that window. Well, in order to do that, they were going to have to expose themselves, and so Adam, being very selfless, this is a guy that was not brought up with all the advantages and all the privileges. He grew up in a little town in Arkansas. He had a pretty rough childhood growing up, but eventually he made a singular decision to change his life, to turn it around, to go become a Navy SEAL, and he also committed his life to the Lord Jesus. Well, Adam says over the radio, I got it. And so he goes out exposing himself on this wall. As he walks out, it's almost like a catwalk as he begins to take rounds through his legs and through his side. He goes down. And so his brothers are working frantically to drag him off this wall. They're working frantically to try and save his life as he's slowly bleeding out. But Adam's concern in that moment, as he's slowly dying, is not himself. Adam's last words were words in an attempt to try and comfort his brothers that were frantically working so hard to try and save his life, as he told them, I'm okay. I'm okay. How can a man say such a thing as this? Well, in one of his letters writing home from a deployment, this is where he describes he develops this sort of fearless attitude. The source of it says, I'm not afraid of anything that might happen to me on this earth because I know no matter what, nothing can take my spirit from me. No matter what, my spirit is given to the Lord and I will finally be victorious. So Memorial Day weekend, we remember these that have paid the ultimate price. You've heard the word, it was just spoken earlier in the prayer, John 15:13. Greater love has no one than this, and one that lays down his life for his friends. You can see it in these examples of these men that have, freedom's not free, paid for in what? Paid for in the bloodshed of our warriors on the battlefield. And may I just suggest to you, consider the one who spoke those words of greater love. It was none other than Jesus of Nazareth. And the way I see him, well, while these shed their blood for our earthly freedom, he shed his blood for our eternal freedom. God bless you all. Thank you so much for having me out this afternoon. Thank you.
He should run for president. Thank you so much, Chad.